I remember the weight of the chain before I understood what it truly meant. The links were cold against my palms, colder than the stone floor beneath my knees, colder than the recycled air that circulated through the chapel of the eternal wrath. Each link had been forged in the same fires that had tempered my bolt pistol, blessed by the same tech priests who had inscribed prayers into the weapon's housing, sanctified by the same rituals that had transformed a boy from a death world into something that might become a space marine. The chain was perhaps 3 feet long, black iron wrapped in silver wire, with a clasp at one end that would lock around my wrist, and another that would bind to my weapon. When I held it up to the candlelight, the links caught the flame and seemed to glow with their own internal fire. The sound they made as I moved them was soft, almost musical, like the whisper of wind through the ribs of the dead. The chapel was vast and empty in the way that Gothic architecture demands. Obsidian columns rose toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadows, each one carved with the names of brothers who had fallen in crusades that stretched back 10,000 years. The walls were decorated with battle honors and campaign banners, faded cloth that had soaked up the blood of 100 worlds. Candles burned in alcoves shaped like skulls, their flames never quite steady, always flickering as if disturbed by breath that had no source. The air was thick with incense, that peculiar mixture of sacred oils and burning parchment that every imperial chapel uses to mask the smell of mortality. But underneath the incense, I could taste something else. Metal and ozone and the faint copper tang of my own fear. I was not alone. 37 other initiates knelt in rows behind me, each one holding his own chain, each one waiting for the moment when we would be transformed from aspirants into full battle brothers of the Black Templars. We had survived the trials that killed 9 out of 10 candidates. We had endured the implantation of gene seed that rewrote our bodies at the cellular level. We had trained for years in the killing arts, learning to wield bolt and blade with the precision that only the Adeptus Astartes could achieve. We had proven ourselves worthy in 100 small ways and a dozen large ones. Now we knelt before the altar of the God Emperor, waiting for the final ceremony that would bind us to the crusade that never ended. At the front of the chapel, beneath a towering aquila carved from black marble, stood Reclusiarch Mordrin. His armor was the deep black of the Black Templars, marked with white crosses and red seals of purity. But it was his helm that commanded attention, the skull-faced helm that every chaplain wore, with its empty eye sockets and exposed teeth, with the tubes and cables that ran from its base into the armor beneath. When Mordrin spoke, his voice came through vox speakers that made each word sound like it was being pronounced from the bottom of a tomb. "Brothers," he began, and the word echoed through the chapel like thunder rolling across distant mountains. "You kneel before the Emperor as boys. You will rise as his warriors. You have been chosen for the greatest honor any man can know, to serve in the ranks of the Black Templars, to join the eternal crusade that our Primarch Rogel Dawn began in the dark days after the heresy, to carry the Emperor's wrath to every corner of the galaxy where his enemies dare to draw breath." I listened to the words and felt pride swell in my chest. This was everything I had worked toward, everything I had sacrificed for. My old life on Mors Prime seemed like a dream from another age, faded and distant and no longer quite real. The boy who had fought with iron bars and desperation had died somewhere along the path to this moment. What knelt here in his place was something new, something forged in pain and dedication and absolute faith. But underneath the pride, there was something else, a sensation I could not quite name. As I held the chain and felt its weight, I found myself thinking about what it represented. This was not decorative. This was not symbolic. When I rose from this ceremony, the chain would be locked to my wrist and locked to my weapon. binding the two together in a marriage that would last until death. I would never be unarmed, never be without my bolter, never able to set it down and walk away, even for a moment. The chain was a promise and a binding, a declaration that the weapon and the warrior were one, that they would fight together until one or both were destroyed. "The chain you hold," Mordrin continued, his skull-faced helm turning to survey us with empty sockets, "is more than iron. It is the physical manifestation of your oath. When you bind your weapon to your flesh, you bind yourself to the crusade. You will never lay down your sword. You will never know peace. You will fight until your last breath leaves your body, and then you will fight as a spirit from beyond the veil, guiding your brothers toward victory in wars you will not live to see concluded." The candles flickered. Somewhere in the vast darkness above us, servo skulls drifted on silent repulsors, their mechanical eyes recording everything for the chapter's archives. I could hear the breathing of my fellow initiates, the slight rustle of their movements, the occasional clink of chains against armor. We were all experiencing this moment together, but I felt profoundly alone, as if the weight of what we were about to swear had created a gulf between each of us that could never be crossed. "This is the blessing and the burden of our eternal crusade," Mordrin said, and his words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. "We do not garrison worlds like other chapters. We do not retreat to fortress monasteries to rest between campaigns. We do not know the luxury of peace or the weakness of hesitation. We are always at war, always moving, always hunting the enemies of mankind across the stars. This is our purpose. This is our glory. This is what it means to be a son of Sigismund, heir to the legacy of Rogel Dawn." I wanted to feel only pride at those words. I wanted to embrace the weight of what was being offered without reservation or doubt. But as I knelt there, holding the chain that would bind me, I could not shake the sensation that I was about to lock myself into something from which there could be no escape. The chain was cold in my hands, so cold it almost burned. And as Mordrin began the final prayers that would complete our transformation, I found myself wondering if the chill I felt was the metal or something else entirely. Something that recognized what I was too young and too zealous to understand. That some bonds, once forged, could never be broken. Not by time, not by distance, not even by death itself. The ceremony ended with fire and blood. Mordrin cut my palm with a consecrated blade, squeezed 3 drops of my blood onto the chain, and spoke words in High Gothic that I only half understood. Something about binding and sacrifice and eternal service. Then he locked one end of the chain to my wrist and the other to my bolt pistol, and the clasp sealed with a click that sounded like the closing of a tomb. I rose as Brother Amadeus of the Black Templars, no longer an initiate but a full battle brother, and the weight on my arm felt heavier than ceramite armor, heavier than duty, heavier than anything I had carried before. I had not always been this. There was a time, distant now, and growing more faded with each passing year, when I had been something else entirely. A boy on a world called Mors Prime, where death was not a possibility but a certainty that arrived early for most. Mors Prime earned its name honestly. It was a death world in the truest sense, a planet where the very air seemed hostile to human life, where survival past adolescence marked you as exceptional and survival past 20 made you a legend among your peers. The world was locked in perpetual twilight, its sun a weak and failing thing that barely penetrated the ash clouds from volcanic ranges that never stopped erupting. We lived in the ruins of cities built by colonists who had arrived with hope and died with regrets, and we survived by being harder than the world that tried to kill us. I had been 12 when the raiders came. Cultists from some forgotten heresy, their ships descending through the ash clouds like falling stars, their intentions written in the blood they spilled in every settlement they touched. They came to our village at dawn, such as dawn was on Moor's prime, and they killed everyone who could not run fast enough. I ran, but not away. I ran toward the shrine at the village center, that small chapel where we had prayed to the Emperor for deliverance that never came. Inside were children younger than myself, hiding beneath pews, crying for parents who were already dead. I found an iron bar, a piece of construction material fallen from the shrine's half-ruined roof, and I stood in the doorway and I fought. I do not remember much of what happened next. Memory has a way of protecting us from the worst moments by wrapping them in fog. But I remember the weight of the bar in my hands. I remember the sound it made against cultist armor and cultist bone. I remember fighting until my arms went numb and my vision tunneled and the taste of blood filled my mouth. When the Black Templars arrived, summoned by whatever distress signal our settlement had managed to send before being overrun, they found me standing in the doorway surrounded by bodies, the iron bar still clutched in hands that had locked around it and would not release. The children behind me were alive. That was all that mattered. Reclusiarch Mordrin himself came to examine me. He looked at the bodies. He looked at the survivors. He looked at my hands, broken and bleeding, still holding the bar that had become an extension of my will. Then he spoke words I would carry with me forever. This one has the fury. Take him. And so I left Moor's prime, bound for a life among the stars and a purpose greater than simple survival. I thought I had been saved. I did not understand that I had only traded one death world for another, larger and more absolute in its demands. Now I stood aboard the Eternal Wrath, a strike cruiser that had not known anchorage for 300 years. The ship was home to 800 battle brothers, and perhaps 10,000 chapter serfs who maintained the vessel, tended the weapons, and kept the machinery of war functioning through prayer and ritual and endless labor. The Eternal Wrath was one of dozens of ships in Crusade Fleet Adamant, which itself was one of dozens of Crusade fleets that bore the Black Templars' banner across the galaxy. We had no homeworld, no fortress monastery where we could retreat between campaigns, no place of rest or reflection. We were always moving, always hunting, always at war. The Black Templars believed that to stop fighting was to betray the Emperor's vision for humanity. We were the sons of Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists, the Emperor's champion who had refused to fortify and defend, who had chosen instead to take the fight to humanity's enemies wherever they could be found. When Rogel Dawn divided his legion after the heresy, when the other Imperial Fists chapters took worlds and built fortresses, Sigismund led his warriors into the void and swore that they would never stop crusading until every enemy of mankind lay dead at their feet. 10,000 years later, we were still fulfilling that oath, still crusading, still fighting, still moving through the dark between stars in search of something to kill. The ship itself was a monument to this philosophy. Every surface was carved with names. The prayer halls held the records of brothers who had fallen in crusades, stretching back millennia, their deeds inscribed in stone and metal, and occasionally in their own dried blood. I would walk through those halls during my early days aboard the Eternal Wrath and try to read the names, try to understand the scope of what I had joined. 10,000 years of war, millions of battles, billions of enemies slain. And still the crusade continued because there were always more enemies, always more worlds to purify, always more heretics and Xenos and traitors who dared to exist in defiance of the Emperor's will. The armories hummed with barely contained violence. Weapons lined the walls in perfect rows, each one maintained with religious devotion. each one ready to speak the Emperor's judgment at a moment's notice. Bolt pistols and bolt rifles, chain swords and power swords, heavy weapons that could crack open tanks and melter guns that could burn through fortress walls. The tech priests who tended these weapons moved among them like worshippers in a temple, their prayers constant, their rituals precise. I learned to maintain my own weapons with the same devotion, understanding that the bolter chained to my wrist was more than a tool. It was a sacred object, a piece of the Emperor's divine machinery given into my keeping. The training cages were where we proved ourselves between battles. Neophytes, still waiting to earn their black armor, would fight each other with blunted blades and powered-down weapons, learning through pain what could not be taught through words. I had spent years in those cages, bleeding and bruised and growing stronger with each session. Now, as a full battle brother, I would still return to them because a warrior who stopped training was a warrior who had begun dying. The sounds from the cages were constant, metal on metal, flesh on flesh, grunts of effort and cries of pain, and the dull thunder of ceramite armor colliding at speed. My brothers were legends made flesh. Marshal Helbrecht, who commanded our fleet, with a severity that permitted no weakness or doubt. Chaplain Grimaldus, whose faith burned so bright it seemed to radiate from his very presence. The Sword Brethren, veterans of centuries who had proven themselves in countless crusades and now stood as exemplars of what we all aspired to become. They moved through the ship like figures from myth, and when they spoke, we listened with the attention that Scripture demanded. They seemed more weapon than man, more concept than flesh, as if they had refined themselves down to pure purpose and discarded everything else as unnecessary weight. I was proud to stand among them, proud to wear the black armor and the white cross, proud to carry the gene seed of Rogel Dawn in my body and the legacy of Sigismund in my heart. I looked at the crusade and saw only glory. I looked at the endless war and saw only purpose. I looked at the chain binding my weapon to my wrist and saw only honor. I did not yet understand what I had truly sworn myself to. I did not understand that some glories are indistinguishable from curses, that some purposes become prisons, that some honors are weights that will eventually crush those who bear them. I was young and zealous and absolutely certain of my righteousness, and that certainty, more than anything else, marked me as someone who had not yet learned what it truly meant to crusade forever. That certainty lasted exactly 3 weeks after my initiation, until the moment we translated into real space above Guest 4, and I saw my first real war. The world was a hive city that had grown until it consumed an entire continent. Billions of souls packed into towers that reached toward a sky they would never see, living and dying in the industrial darkness of the lower levels, while the wealthy gazed at stars from spires kilometers above. A chaos cult had wormed its way into the planetary government, corrupting officials and poisoners alike, until they felt confident enough to reveal themselves. They poisoned the water supply of 3 entire hive districts. 16 million dead in a single night, their bodies convulsing as demonic toxins rewrote their flesh from within. The survivors found themselves worshipping gods whose names should never have been spoken. We deployed with righteous fury. 40 brothers from the eternal wrath dropping through atmospheric fire in pods that screamed like falling angels. I was in the first wave, mag-locked to the deployment harness, my bolter heavy against my chest, the chain connecting it to my wrist pulled taut by the acceleration. The impact was violent enough to crack teeth, the pod's retro thrusters firing at the last possible moment, slamming us into the hive city's upper levels with enough force to shatter ferrocrete and send debris cascading into the levels below. The door blew outward with explosive bolts, and I stepped into my first real battle. The Chaos cultists were waiting for us, hundreds of them armed with autoguns and improvised weapons and absolute faith in their dark gods. They charged with the fury of the mad, screaming prayers to entities I will not name, their eyes reflecting something that was not quite light. I raised my bolter and fired, and the weapon spoke with a voice that was pure thunder, each mass reactive shell finding its target with the precision that the machine god had built into its sacred mechanisms. The cultists died. They died by the dozen, by the score, their bodies coming apart under the impact of bolter rounds that exploded inside flesh and bone. I advanced through their ranks, my brothers beside me, our armor black against the hive's industrial glow, our weapons singing hymns of destruction that had been composed 10,000 years ago and would be sung for 10,000 more. For the first time since leaving Moor's Prime, I felt the rush of combat, that clarity of purpose that comes when everything unnecessary falls away and all that remains is the simple mathematics of survival. Kill or be killed. Advance or die. These were equations I understood. I saved Brother Casimir's life during the assault on the cult's primary shrine. He had pushed too far ahead, his zeal carrying him into a kill box where cultists with heavy stubbers had set up overlapping fields of fire. I saw him go down, his armor sparking under the impacts, and I did not think. I simply moved, placing myself between him and the guns, my own armor absorbing rounds that would have killed him. Then I killed the gunners, walking through their fire until I was close enough to see the whites of their eyes before I pulled the trigger. When I helped Casimir to his feet, he gripped my arm with enough force to dent the ceramite, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Brotherhood. True brotherhood. Forged not in ceremony but in blood. Marshal Helbrecht himself commended me after the shrine fell. He placed his hand on my shoulder guard and said I had fought with the fury of Sigismund himself. I felt invincible. I felt purposeful. I felt like everything I had endured had led to this moment, this validation, this proof that I belonged among the Emperor's chosen warriors. But the campaign did not end with the shrine's fall. That was only the beginning. The cult leaders were dead, their bodies burned and their ashes scattered. But corruption had spread too deep to be excised so cleanly. There were sympathizers to root out, civilian populations that had witnessed heretical rites and been tainted by the seeing. There were entire districts that needed to be purged with fire, their populations executed not because they were guilty, but because they might be guilty, because uncertainty was a luxury we could not afford. The Black Templars did not leave until every trace of corruption was scoured away, and corruption had very deep roots. 1 week became 2. 2 became a month became 2. We fought through the hive city level by level, clearing each district with the thoroughness that faith demanded. The cultists fought back with desperation, using civilians as shields, rigging entire habitation blocks with explosives, poisoning wells and contaminating food supplies until famine became another weapon in their arsenal. We countered with our own brutality, executing anyone who hesitated too long when asked about their faith, burning sectors that might harbor heretics, advancing through ruins that we ourselves had created. I began to feel something I did not have words for. Not physical exhaustion, though my armor bore new scars and my body ached with the memory of impacts. Something deeper, a weariness that settled into my bones and would not leave no matter how much I prayed or trained or fought. I started to notice things I had not seen before. The way Brother Sergeant Theron's hands shook slightly when he removed his helmet. How he would stare at nothing for long minutes, as if seeing something the rest of us could not. The flatness in Castellan Marcus's voice when he gave orders, as if he were reading from a script he had memorized centuries ago and no longer truly heard. The way the older brothers moved through the battles with mechanical precision, killing with perfect efficiency, but without the rage or passion that I still felt. There was something in their eyes, a hollowness that zealotry could not quite fill, a distance that suggested they were seeing through the present moment to something far beyond it. I caught Brother Casimir looking at me once during a lull in the fighting, and in his eyes I saw something that might have been pity, as if he knew something I did not, as if he had seen this before in other young brothers who had just earned their chains. 4 months into the campaign, we finally received orders to deploy to our next objective. The cult on Guest 4 was broken, its remnants scattered into the Underhive where they would eventually starve or kill each other. The planetary government was being reformed under inquisitorial oversight. Our work was done. I expected we would return to the eternal wrath for rest, for repair, for at least a brief respite before the next deployment. Instead, we went directly to the next crusade. The fleet was already moving, already translating toward the warp, already pointed at another world where enemies waited to be killed. There was no ceremony of completion, no moment of reflection. We simply moved from one war to the next without pause, without hesitation, without acknowledgement that we might need anything except another target. I stood in the chapel that night, looking at the chain on my wrist, and for the first time I truly heard the Reclusiarch's words from my initiation. You will never lay down your sword. You will never know peace. I had thought it was metaphor, poetry, the kind of dramatic language that ceremonies required. I had not understood it was simply truth, spoken plainly and without embellishment. We would never stop. The crusade would continue until we died, and then it would continue without us, carried forward by brothers who had not yet learned what we were learning. That glory and purpose and honor were words we used to make the unbearable seem noble. That realization should have prepared me for what followed, but knowledge and understanding are not the same thing. I knew the crusade would not end. I did not understand what that meant until years had passed, and I looked back at the trail of war we had left behind us, and could no longer count the battles or remember all the worlds. We fought on Calistan Prime, an ice world where the cold burned through ceramite and turned unprotected flesh to crystal in seconds. The enemy was a xeno species that burrowed through glaciers, ambushing from below, dragging brothers down into frozen darkness where their screams were cut short by temperatures that made metal brittle and breath impossible. I learned to listen for the cracking of ice, to feel the tremors that announced an attack, to fire into the ground beneath my feet and hope the mass reactive shells found flesh before the ice gave way. We won, but it took 3 months and cost us 11 brothers whose bodies would never be recovered from the frozen deep. We fought on Helios Secundus, a forge world where the heat was so intense, it warped the air into visible waves and turned unshielded skin to char in minutes. The heretic priests who had seized control of the manufacturing complexes fought with corrupted servitors and machines that had been twisted by forbidden knowledge until they hunted with something approaching malice. The battles took place in foundries where molten metal ran in rivers, and the air itself was toxic with industrial fumes. Brother Matthias died when a corrupted furnace exploded, his armor melting around him before we could reach him. His screams lasted for 37 seconds. I counted every one. We fought on Mortis Hollow, a dead world where nothing lived and nothing grew, where the silence itself felt like an enemy waiting to suffocate us. The Traitor Guard regiment that had made it their base operated from bunkers carved into dead stone, and we had to dig them out one position at a time, clearing tunnels that seemed to stretch forever into darkness. The absence of sound was worse than any weapon. Our Vox channels filled with unnecessary chatter just to break the oppressive quiet, and when brothers died, they died in silence, their bodies simply ceasing to function without the dramatic flourish that combat usually provided. World after world, enemy after enemy, year after year. The crusade continued without pause, without rest, without mercy for those of us who carried it forward. I became skilled in the arts of war, earning commendations and honors that were inscribed into my armor and recorded in the chapter's archives. I learned to read battlefields the way scholars read texts, understanding the language of terrain and positioning, predicting enemy movements before they occurred. I became the warrior that the Black Templars had shaped me to be, efficient and deadly, and absolutely committed to the prosecution of our eternal war. But I also began to notice patterns that disturbed me more than any enemy ever could. The crusade never stopped. When one campaign ended, another began immediately, sometimes before we had even left the previous war zone. There was always another enemy, another world that needed purification, another heretic or xenos or traitor that required the Emperor's judgment delivered at the end of a bolter. The galaxy was infinite in its capacity to produce threats, and we were finite in our capacity to eliminate them. The mathematics were impossible, but we pursued them anyway because the alternative was to admit that our crusade was futile, and that admission was more heretical than anything the enemy could conceive. I watched brothers fall, good men, brave warriors who deserved better than the deaths they received. Brother Casimir, who had saved my life as I had once saved his, torn apart by orc chain choppers on a world whose name I no longer remember. Brother Sergeant Theron, who had mentored me in tactics, killed by a sniper's round that found the weak point where his gorget met his helmet. Castellan Marcus, who had led our squad with quiet competence for 40 years, crushed beneath debris when a building collapsed during street-to-street fighting against cultists who would not surrender. Their names were carved into the memorial walls alongside thousands who had come before them. New recruits took their places, young and eager as I had once been, their eyes bright with the zealotry that had not yet been worn down by the reality of endless war. I tried to remember the faces of my fallen brothers, to preserve some memory of who they had been beyond the names carved in stone, but there were too many. Faces blurred together. Voices became indistinguishable. The individual details that made each brother unique were lost in the vast accumulation of the dead. I tried to recall what peace had felt like on Moor's Prime, but the memory had faded like a dream upon waking. Had there been moments of quiet? Times when I had not been fighting or preparing to fight? I searched my past and found only blurred impressions, like looking at a pictograph that had been damaged by water and time. Even my dreams were filled with battle. I would close my eyes during the sleep cycles and find myself still fighting, still advancing through hostile terrain, still pulling the trigger on enemies who kept coming no matter how many fell. I woke more exhausted than I had been before sleeping, and the cycle continued without respite. The chain on my wrist, once a symbol of honor and commitment, began to feel like exactly what it was: a binding, a restraint, a physical manifestation of oaths that could not be broken and duties that could not be set aside. The weight of it was constant, a reminder with every movement that I was not free, had never been free, would never be free as long as I drew breath. Other chapters had fortresses they could return to, home worlds where they could walk under open skies and remember what it meant to exist as something other than instruments of war. The Black Templars had only war, only the crusade, only the endless march from one battlefield to the next. I mentioned this to no one. The thoughts themselves felt like weakness, like the first symptoms of some spiritual corruption that might spread if given voice. My brothers did not speak of doubt or exhaustion or the weight of chains that had once seemed light. They fought with the same zeal they had always shown, or at least they performed zeal with enough conviction that I could not tell the difference. Perhaps they felt nothing. Perhaps the years of war had burned away whatever capacity for doubt they had once possessed. Or perhaps they simply hid it better than I did, maintaining the facade of absolute commitment, because to do otherwise would be to admit that we were not quite as blessed as we claimed to be. That silence, that hidden doubt, sustained me through the decades that followed. I learned to bury the thoughts deep, to perform certainty with enough conviction that even I sometimes believed it. The crusade continued, and I continued with it, fighting with the efficiency that had earned me recognition and promotion. When Castellan Marcus fell, Marshal Helbrecht named me to take his place. I should have felt pride at the honor. Instead, I felt a creeping numbness, as if some essential part of me had been worn away by the constant friction of war until nothing remained but the smooth surface of function. I commanded my own squad now. 10 brothers whose lives depended on my tactical decisions, whose deaths would be recorded in reports bearing my signature. We deployed to Sanctus Tertius, a shrine world overrun by an orc Wah that had torn through the sector like a green tide of violence and crude laughter. The planet's surface was covered with cathedrals and monuments, 10,000 years of accumulated faith rendered in stone and precious metals, all of it now defiled by Xenos who built their camps in holy places and used sacred texts as kindling for their cooking fires. The fighting was brutal in ways that even decades of war had not prepared me for. Close-quarters combat in ruined cathedrals where the architecture itself became a weapon, where pillars provided cover and collapsed naves created kill zones that favored neither side. The orcs fought with the savage joy they brought to all conflicts, their crude weapons effective through sheer brutality if not sophistication. My squad moved through the ruins with practiced efficiency, our bolters speaking judgment against Xenos who had no concept of the sacrilege they committed simply by existing in this place. We cleared the Cathedral of St. Margith in 4 hours of sustained combat, room by room, chamber by chamber, putting down orcs who fought until their bodies literally could not continue, who charged with their guts hanging out and their arms severed, who died laughing because battle itself was their highest pleasure. My brothers fought flawlessly, every movement coordinated, every shot placed with precision, every order I gave executed without hesitation or question. We performed like the weapon that decades of war had forged us into. But when the cathedral was cleared and I removed my helmet to survey the damage, I found myself staring at the bodies of my brothers who had fallen during the assault. 3 of them lay among the orc corpses, their black armor scarred and breached, their gene seed already recovered by our apothecary. I looked at their faces and realized with horror that I could not remember their names. I knew I should know them. They had fought beside me for years. I had given them orders, shared watch rotations with them, stood with them during prayer services. But their names had vanished from my memory like smoke in wind, and their faces were already beginning to blur into the vast accumulation of all the other faces I had seen in death. How many brothers had I fought beside over the decades? How many had I watched die? I tried to count and found that the numbers had lost all meaning. Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands if I counted every brother I had served with across all the campaigns and crusades. The individual deaths that should have carried weight had been diluted by sheer volume until they became statistics rather than losses, data points in reports rather than the endings of lives that had mattered. That night, after the dead had been honored and their gene seeds sent to the apothecarian, I walked to the memorial hall in the depths of the eternal wrath. The hall was vast, its walls covered floor to ceiling with names carved in obsidian, each inscription marking a brother who had fallen in service to the crusade. I found my own handwriting scattered throughout, names I had inscribed decades ago during the brief ceremonies where we honored our dead before moving immediately to the next war. Brother Casimir, Brother Matthias, Castellan Marcus. I had carved these names myself, pressing the inscription stylus into stone with hands that shook from exhaustion and grief. But I could no longer picture their faces with any clarity. Marcus's voice had faded to a whisper in memory. Casimir's laugh, which had once been so distinctive, had become indistinguishable from a dozen other laughs I half remembered. They were names now, nothing more, preserved in stone because flesh and memory were too impermanent to be trusted. I continued reading, finding more names in my handwriting, names I had no recollection of carving. Brothers I had apparently known well enough to honor with my own hand, but whose existence had been completely erased from my conscious memory. The memorial hall preserved what I could not. It remembered when I forgot. And if the hall had not existed, these brothers would have disappeared entirely, as if they had never lived at all. The serfs who maintained the ship told stories during their off hours, whispered legends about brothers who had fought for impossible lengths of time. 400 years, 500. Some rumored to have served for entire millennia, ancient warriors who had walked beside Sigismund himself, and somehow continued walking long after their Primarch had fallen. I had always assumed these were exaggerations, the kind of mythology that grew around any institution old enough to have accumulated legends. But now I began to understand they might be true. And worse, I began to understand what that meant. The curse was not death. We should not have feared dying in battle, our gene seed harvested, our names carved in stone, our service complete. The curse was the opposite. Living too long, fighting too much, becoming so worn by eternal war that nothing else remained. Memory failed, identity eroded. Everything that made us who we were gradually disappeared until only the weapon remained, still functional, still efficient, still killing, but hollow in ways that no amount of zealotry could disguise. I needed counsel, though I dreaded seeking it. I found Reclusiarch Mordrin in his chambers, surrounded by books of scripture and holy relics, preparing the liturgy for the next day's morning prayers. When I confessed my doubts, he responded with scripture as I knew he would. Quotes from the Codex Astartes about duty and sacrifice. Passages from the Imperial Creed about the blessedness of service. Words about how the individual meant nothing compared to the greater purpose of humanity's survival. But as he spoke, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. His hands shook slightly as he held his Crozius Arcanum, that sacred weapon that was both symbol and instrument of his office. The tremor was barely visible, easily dismissed as fatigue or the strain of holding the heavy weapon. But I saw it, and I understood what it meant. Mordrin had served for over 2 centuries. He had presided over the deaths of thousands of brothers, spoken the funeral rites so many times the words had become automatic, carried the burden of maintaining faith in a crusade that had no end in sight. Even he, the shepherd of our faith, the keeper of our spiritual health, was not immune to the erosion that eventually claimed us all. I left Mordrin's chambers with scripture ringing in my ears and doubt gnawing at my heart. If even the Reclusiarch showed signs of the erosion I feared, then perhaps there was no escape from what we were becoming. Perhaps the curse was absolute, touching every brother regardless of rank or faith or strength of will. I carried that thought with me through the following weeks, a weight heavier than armor, more burdensome than any weapon. The revelation that would change everything came 3 months later, when our fleet encountered a space hulk drifting near the Eye of Terror. The massive conglomeration of fused ships had been detected by our auger arrays, its warp signature suggesting it had been in and out of the immaterium for millennia. Marshal Helbrecht ordered a boarding action, both to claim any salvageable technology and to ensure no corruption had taken root in its twisted corridors. I led the first boarding party, my squad mag-locking to the hull and cutting our way through layers of fused metal that had been warped by exposure to energies no material was meant to endure. The hulk's interior was a maze of corridors from a dozen different ships, their architecture merged in ways that defied rational geometry. We moved carefully, weapons raised, expecting cultists or worse at every turn. But the hulk was empty. Dead. Whatever crews had once walked these passages were long gone, leaving only the ghosts of their presence in the rust-stained walls and the silence that pressed against us like something physical. We found the sanctuary in what had once been a chapel aboard an ancient strike cruiser, its design marking it as pre-heresy construction. The door was sealed with the symbol of the Black Templars, the cross and chain rendered in metal that had somehow survived when everything around it had corroded. I placed my hand against the seal and felt it recognize the gene signature in my armor. Ancient mechanisms groaned to life, and the door opened for the first time in 8,000 years. The chamber beyond was perfectly preserved, protected by stasis fields that had continued functioning through millennia of drift and darkness. Within were the remains of brothers who had died in those first crusades, their armor still black despite the passage of epochs, their weapons still clutched in hands that had been reduced to bone. They had been arranged with care, positioned as if sleeping rather than dead, and around them were personal effects that spoke of lives lived between the battles. Prayer beads, small icons, pieces of equipment that had been maintained beyond any tactical necessity because they connected their bearers to something human. But it was the walls that drew my attention. They were covered with inscriptions, carved directly into the metal with what must have been combat knives or the edges of armor plates. Personal accounts, confessions, warnings left by brothers who had known they were dying and wanted their words to survive them. I began to read, moving from inscription to inscription, my helmet lamps illuminating text that had waited 8 millennia for eyes that could understand its significance. Most were brief, names and dates, final prayers to the Emperor, declarations of faith that sounded hollow in the silence of this tomb. But one inscription, longer than the others, commanded my full attention. It had been carved with obvious care, the letters precise despite the crude tool used to make them. The signature at the bottom read, Castellan Varick, 10th Company, Crusade Fleet Eternal. We swore to crusade until all enemies of mankind were slain, it began. We took this oath with joy, believing we served a purpose greater than ourselves, that our sacrifice would somehow matter in the vast calculation of humanity's survival. We were told this was honor. We were told this was blessing. We believed it absolutely because we were young and certain and had not yet learned what our oaths would cost us. I traced the words with my gauntlet, feeling the grooves in the metal, imagining Varick carving them in this very chamber while his brothers lay dying around him. But the enemies are infinite. There is always another war, another world, another threat that demands our attention. We finish one crusade only to begin another. We slay one foe only to find 10 more waiting beyond the horizon. The mathematics are impossible, but we pursue them anyway, because to stop would be to admit that our crusade has no end, that our sacrifice has no limit, that we have sworn ourselves to something that will consume us completely and still demand more. My hands had begun to shake. I gripped my bolter tighter, the chain pulling taut against my wrist. We told ourselves this was honor, but I fear it is punishment. We have become the very thing we fight, relentless, merciless, incapable of stopping. Our zeal has made us prisoners to war itself. We cannot lay down our swords because we no longer remember how. The capacity for peace, for rest, for anything that is not combat, has been worn away by decades of endless fighting, until only the crusade remains. We are not men who fight. We are fighting made flesh, given thought and purpose, and chained to weapons we can never set aside. I read the words again, and then a third time, needing to be certain I understood their meaning. Varric had seen what I was only beginning to comprehend. The crusade vow was not a blessing. It was a curse disguised as honor, a trap that closed slowly over decades and centuries until escape became impossible. The Emperor demanded warriors who would never stop fighting, and we answered with absolute commitment. But the Emperor never told us how to remain human while fighting forever. Perhaps he did not know, perhaps he did not care, or perhaps he understood that some causes require the sacrifice not just of life, but of everything that makes life worth living. We are his instruments, perfected for a single purpose and useless for all others. And when we finally die, younger brothers will take our places, just as zealous, just as certain, just as doomed to learn what we have learned too late to matter. The inscription ended with a final line, carved deeper than the others, as if Varric had pressed hard enough to make the words permanent beyond any possibility of erasure. Beware the honor that cannot be set down. Beware the blessing that becomes bondage. Beware the chain that binds so tightly you forget it is there until you try to move and discover you cannot. I stood in the silence of that ancient chamber, surrounded by the remains of brothers who had died 8,000 years ago, and understood with perfect clarity what I had truly sworn myself to. We were trapped. All of us. Every Black Templar who had ever taken the crusade vow had locked themselves into an eternal cycle from which there was no escape. We fought not because we chose to, but because we had lost the ability to choose anything else. The chain on my wrist was more than symbolic. It was literal truth rendered in iron and adamantium, a binding that would last until death and perhaps beyond. I returned from the space hulk, carrying knowledge that I could not share, and a weight that I could not set down. The inscription was seared into my memory, every word of Castellan Varric's warning, as clear as if I had carved it myself. I reported the discovery to Marshal Helbrecht, describing the ancient sanctuary and the remains of brothers who had died in humanity's first crusades. I did not mention the inscriptions on the walls. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, too corrosive to the faith that held our chapter together. So I kept silent and watched the knowledge change everything about how I saw the world around me. The brothers I had once viewed as glorious crusaders now appeared as something else entirely. Hollow men wearing the masks of zealots, performing righteousness with mechanical precision because they had long ago forgotten how to do anything else. I watched them during battles, studied the way they moved and fought and killed. There was efficiency in every action, perfection in every motion, but no passion, no rage, no joy or sorrow or fear, or any emotion that might mark them as something more than weapons that happened to think. They recited prayers by rote, the words falling from their lips without meaning or feeling. Liturgies they had spoken so many times the syllables had become pure reflex. Brother Ancient Sigmar had fought for 4 centuries. I watched him during an engagement against heretics on a mining world, observed the way he moved through enemy positions like water flowing downhill, his bolter barking with metronomic regularity, his blade finding throats and hearts with the precision of long practice. He killed 23 enemies in the span of 4 minutes, each death delivered with perfect efficiency. But his face, visible through his damaged helmet, showed nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no acknowledgement that he was ending lives. He was simply executing a function, performing a task, being the weapon that 400 years of war had refined him into. Brother Castellan Demetrius still spoke, but only in scripture. Every sentence was a quote from the Codex Astartes or the Imperial Creed, or the words of Sigismund preserved in the chapter's archives. I do not think he was capable of original thought anymore. His mind had become a library of pre-approved responses, cycling through them as situations demanded, selecting the appropriate quote as a servitor might select the appropriate tool. When a neophyte asked him a question about tactics, he responded with Sigismund's words from 6,000 years ago. When I asked him how he felt after a particularly brutal campaign, he quoted scripture about duty and sacrifice. The man who had once inhabited that armor had disappeared, leaving only the armor and the words it had memorized. A ceremony was held 3 weeks after our return from the Space Hulk. 5 neophytes were being elevated to full battle brothers, their training complete, their worth proven in blood across a dozen war zones. I attended because my rank demanded it, standing among the other Castellans as Reclusiarch Mordrin performed the rituals that would bind these young warriors to the crusade forever. I watched one neophyte in particular, a boy whose name I learned was Tiberian, whose eyes held the same fierce certainty that mine had held decades ago. Mordrin placed the chain in Tiberian's hands, speaking the same words he had spoken to me, to hundreds before me, to thousands before them. You will never lay down your sword. You will never know peace. This is the blessing and the burden of our eternal crusade. Tiberian's face showed only pride as he locked the chain to his wrist and weapon, sealing himself into oaths he did not understand, committing himself to a fate he could not imagine. I saw my younger self in his eyes and wanted desperately to warn him, to tell him what the crusade would cost him, to explain that the honor he felt would gradually be replaced by numbness, that the purpose burning in his chest would eventually gutter and die, that the chain he was accepting with such joy would become a prison he could never escape. But I could not speak. To question the crusade was to question everything the chapter stood for. To suggest that our most sacred vows were curses rather than blessings would be heresy of the highest order. So I remained silent and watched Tiberian rise as a full brother, his face radiant with certainty that would not survive contact with decades of endless war. I began noticing patterns in the older Templars that I had previously dismissed or ignored. Brother Ancient Castiel, who had served for 300 years, had stopped speaking entirely except to give tactical orders or recite prayers during services. The rest of the time he moved through the ship in silence, his face locked in an expression that might have been concentration, but looked more like absence. Brother Thaddeus, a veteran of 2 centuries, maintained his weapons with obsessive intensity, spending hours each day cleaning bolters that were already immaculate, sharpening blades that needed no sharpening, performing rituals of maintenance that had long since transcended any practical purpose and become compulsions he could not resist. Brother Sergeant Roland had developed a tic that manifested during quiet moments. His hands would move through combat forms, his fingers pulling imaginary triggers, his arms swinging invisible blades. He was fighting constantly, even when no enemies were present, his body unable to remain at rest because rest had become a foreign concept his nervous system no longer recognized. And Brother Maximilian, who had earned more honors than any 3 brothers combined, would sometimes erupt into violence at imagined slights. A serf moving too slowly, a junior brother asking an unnecessary question. Anything could trigger rages that seemed divorced from the provocations that spawned them. Fury that had to find outlets because it had been burning too long and too hot to ever be fully contained. The curse manifested differently in each brother, but it was always there once I knew to look for it. The silence, the obsessions, the mechanical movements, the hollow eyes, the violent outbursts, all of them symptoms of the same disease that had no cure and only one prognosis. We would continue fighting until we died, and the fighting would destroy us long before death finally came. I began reviewing casualty reports with new understanding, reading between the lines of official accounts that described glorious deaths in service to the Emperor. Brother Castor, who had thrown himself at a Chaos dreadnought with nothing but a combat knife. Brother Isidore, who had charged alone into an orc mob despite having functional support from his squad. Brother Matthias, who had remained in a collapsing building to ensure every enemy died with him when simpler tactics would have preserved his life. The reports called them heroes, acts of supreme sacrifice, examples for younger brothers to emulate. But I knew the truth now. They had not been heroes. They had been desperate men who had found the only escape available to them. Oblivion was preferable to another century of endless war, and death in battle was the only honorable way to achieve it. They had thrown themselves at impossible odds, not because tactics demanded it, but because they could not bear to continue existing in chains that would never be unlocked. The chapter could not acknowledge this truth. It could not admit that the eternal crusade destroyed those who undertook it, that our most sacred vow was a form of damnation, that we were slowly killing ourselves in service to something that demanded everything and gave nothing back except more war. To acknowledge this would be to shatter the foundation upon which the chapter stood. So we maintained the fiction, performed the rituals, spoke the words, and pretended that our zealotry was genuine rather than the desperate performance of men who had nothing left except the roles they had been assigned. I carried this knowledge with me into the next campaign, and it poisoned everything I touched. The target was a Chaos stronghold on the world of Varsavia, a fortress that had stood for 3,000 years in defiance of every imperial force sent to claim it. The heretics had dug deep into the planet's crust, creating a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that extended for kilometers beneath the surface. Intelligence estimates suggested the campaign would take years to prosecute, possibly decades if the enemy fought with the tenacity their history suggested. Marshal Helbrecht committed 3 full crusade fleets to the operation, thousands of Black Templars who would not leave until every heretic was dead and every tunnel purified with flame. I led my squad into those depths, descending through layers of rock and corrupted architecture, fighting battles in darkness so absolute, our helmet lamps could barely penetrate it. The Chaos Marines we faced were veterans of the Long War, traitors who had been fighting since the heresy itself, who had turned their backs on the Emperor and embraced powers that promised freedom and delivered only slavery of a different kind. They fought with skill born of millennia of practice, and they died hard when they died at all. But as the campaign stretched from months into years, I found myself crumbling internally even as I fought with my customary skill. Every battle felt like the same battle, the same tactical problem solved with the same solutions, the same enemies wearing different faces but wielding the same weapons and dying in the same ways. Every brother who fell seemed like the same loss repeated into infinity, individual deaths rendered meaningless by their sheer accumulation. I carved their names into the memorial walls and forgot them before the inscription was complete. I began to fantasize about death, not as something to fear but as release. The only way a Black Templar was ever freed from the crusade was to die in battle, to have his gene seed harvested, and his name added to the rolls of honor and his service. Finally, mercifully concluded. Death was not punishment but reward, not defeat but victory, not an end but the only possible escape from the prison we had locked ourselves into. I found myself envying the brothers who fell, who achieved in death what they could never have achieved in life. Peace, rest, silence. But I was too skilled, too experienced. Decades of war had refined my combat instincts to the point where survival was automatic, where tactical decisions happened faster than conscious thought, where my body moved through battles with the efficiency of a well-maintained machine. I survived when others fell. I endured when others found release. During a particularly brutal engagement in the fortress's lower levels, I found myself in close combat with a Chaos Marine whose armor bore the marks of 5,000 years of war. His blade was a thing of corrupted beauty, its edge shimmering with energies that could cut through ceramite as easily as flesh. We fought in a corridor lit only by muzzle flashes and the hellish glow of his weapon, and as we struggled, I found myself hoping his blade would find the gap in my armor, hoping it would slip between plates and end what I could not end myself. The blade missed. By centimeters, by the width of a prayer. I killed him and survived again, and the knowledge that I had wanted to die terrified me more than any enemy ever could. I confided in Brother Castellan Tiberius 3 days later, during a lull in the fighting while we waited for reinforcements to arrive before pushing deeper into the fortress complex. Tiberius had served for 300 years, earning honors and commendations that should have elevated him to marshal, but which he had turned down repeatedly, preferring to remain where he was, doing what he knew, fighting until fighting was all that remained. We sat in a chapel carved from bare rock, surrounded by icons we had erected to sanctify this captured space, and I told him what I had felt during the battle, the hope for death, the desire for release, the terrible understanding that I had become a prisoner to oaths I could no longer remember, swearing with genuine faith. Tiberius listened without interruption, his scarred face showing no surprise or judgment. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes focused on something far beyond the chapel walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of someone who had moved past feeling decades ago and now existed in a state beyond emotion. "We are already dead, brother," he said. "The moment we took our vows, we died to everything except war. What walks in this armor is just the ghost of who we were, animated by oaths we can never break and a fury we can no longer control. We are the Emperor's vengeance given form, but vengeance is not meant to be alive. It is meant to be spent and forgotten." His words struck me like physical blows, not because they were cruel or false, but because they were true in ways I had not yet been able to articulate. We were ghosts, all of us, every Black Templar who had fought long enough to forget why we fought. We moved and spoke and killed, but the essential spark that made us human had been extinguished somewhere along the march from one war to the next. What remained was function without purpose, motion without meaning, existence without life. "How do you endure it?" I asked. "How do you continue when you know what we have become?" Tiberius turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw the answer before he spoke it. "I do not endure. I simply continue. There is a difference. Endurance suggests some part of you remains capable of experiencing the burden. Continuation is what happens when that part dies, and only the habit of motion remains. I continue because I no longer remember how to stop. The crusade has become the only reality I can recognize. Everything else is foreign territory, hostile and incomprehensible." He stood, his armor joints whispering as servos compensated for his movement. "You still feel the weight, Amadeus. That means some part of you remains alive. Perhaps you are fortunate. Perhaps you are cursed. I can no longer tell the difference. But I can tell you this. The weight will not lighten with time. It will grow heavier until it crushes whatever part of you still struggles beneath it. And when that happens, you will either embrace the death you crave, or you will become what I have become. A ghost in black armor, fighting because fighting is all that ghosts know how to do." He left me alone in the chapel, surrounded by icons that offered no comfort and prayers that fell into silence without echo. I knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but the words would not come. What could I ask for? Deliverance? There was none except death, and death would not come while I remained too skilled to die easily. Strength? I had strength enough to continue fighting for decades or centuries, more, and that strength was the curse rather than the blessing. Faith? Faith was what had brought me to this moment, what had convinced me to take oaths that would destroy me slowly rather than quickly. I remained kneeling until my legs went numb, and the chapel's meager light began to fade. The campaign would continue tomorrow, and I would continue with it, fighting with skill and efficiency and the hollow dedication of a man who had recognized the truth about what he had become. We were all damned, all suffering the slow death of meaning grinding away under the weight of eternal purpose. And there was no escape except the one we craved and could not achieve. Death in battle, final and absolute, the only mercy the crusade would ever grant its most faithful servants. The campaign ended 3 years after it began, with the final assault on the fortress's central sanctum, where the Chaos Lord who commanded the stronghold had made his last stand. I led the breach, my squad moving through corridors that had been consecrated to dark powers for millennia, where the walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the air tasted of corruption so thick it fouled our armor's atmospheric filters. The Chaos Lord waited for us in a chamber carved from black stone, surrounded by his chosen champions, warriors who had betrayed the Emperor before my chapter had even been founded. The battle was brief and brutal. My brothers died well, their gene seed harvested even as the fighting continued around their fallen forms. But we won, as we always won, through superior skill and absolute commitment and the weight of numbers that endless crusading provided. The Chaos Marines fell one by one until only their champion remained, a warrior whose armor bore heraldry I recognized from histories of the heresy itself. He had fought for 10,000 years, served dark gods for longer than my chapter had existed, and when I finally brought him down with a burst from my plasma pistol that burned through his corrupted ceramite, he laughed with his dying breath. "You call yourself crusaders," he said, blood bubbling through his vox grill. "But you are slaves. You cannot stop fighting because you have forgotten everything else. Your curse is that you will win every battle and lose yourselves in the winning. We chose damnation. You never had a choice at all." I executed him with my chainsword, severing his head from his body, but his words continued echoing long after his corpse had been burned and his taint purified with flame. That night, as the fleet prepared to depart Varsavia for the next crusade, I found myself standing in the chapel, aboard the Eternal Wrath, surrounded by brothers who knelt in prayer, their chains rattling against armor as they gave thanks for victory and prepared their spirits for whatever war awaited us beyond the warp. I looked down at the chain binding my bolter to my wrist and understood with perfect clarity that I stood at a precipice from which there could be no return. The chain could be removed, the vows could be broken. I could request reassignment to some fortress world garrison, some role that did not require endless crusading, some position where I might remember what it meant to exist as something other than a weapon in constant use. The chapter would consider me weak, perhaps execute me for breaking oaths that were supposed to be eternal. But I would be free. The thought was intoxicating in its simplicity. To set down the bolter, to remove the armor, to walk under open sky without the weight of duty crushing down upon me, to sleep without dreams of battle, to speak without reciting scripture, to exist without the constant grinding motion of war wearing away everything that remained of whoever I had once been. Freedom, rest, peace, all the things I had forsworn when I took my vows, available again if I was willing to pay the price of shame and dishonor and execution. My hand moved toward the chain's clasp, fingers tracing the mechanism that had locked it closed decades ago. One movement, one choice, one moment of weakness or strength, depending on how you measured such things. I could end this. I could escape the curse that Castellan Varick had warned about 8,000 years ago. I could choose oblivion over the slow erosion that would eventually reduce me to what Tiberius had become, a ghost in armor, continuing because continuation was all that remained. But then I looked up and saw the younger brothers kneeling among the veterans. Neophytes and initiates, their armor still bearing the sheen of recent forging, their eyes still bright with the zealotry that had not yet been worn down by decades of endless war. I saw Tiberian, the young brother whose initiation I had witnessed, his face showing the same fierce certainty that mine had held when Mordrin first placed the chain in my hands. They had not yet felt the full weight of the curse. They still believed in the glory they had been promised. They still thought that honor and purpose would sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. And someone had to shield them. Someone had to guide them. Someone had to help them endure what I had endured, to preserve whatever humanity could be preserved in the face of eternal war. If I abandoned them to seek my own escape, they would face the crushing realization alone, without any context or understanding, without anyone to tell them that what they felt was not weakness, but the inevitable consequence of oaths that demanded too much and gave too little in return. I could not save them from the curse. No one could. But I could walk beside them through it, bearing the weight so that they did not have to bear it alone. I could offer whatever wisdom my suffering had purchased, whatever small insights might make the endless march slightly more bearable. I could be what no one had been for me, a brother who acknowledged the truth of what we were becoming while still choosing to continue anyway. My hand moved away from the clasp. The chain remained locked. The choice was made. It was not redemption. I had done nothing that required redemption, and there was no salvation waiting at the end of this decision. It was not even hope, because hope suggested the possibility of better outcomes, and I knew with certainty that the only outcome was more war and more death, and the slow grinding away of everything that made us human. It was simply the choice to suffer with purpose rather than without. The choice to bear a curse that could not be escaped so that others did not have to bear it alone. The choice to remain a prisoner so that my brothers might have a guide who understood their chains. I knelt among my brothers and resumed the prayer I had abandoned, the words falling from my lips automatically while my mind worked through the implications of what I had chosen. The crusade would continue. I would continue with it, fighting and killing and dying slowly, across decades or centuries, while watching each generation of young brothers repeat the same journey from zealous certainty to hollow endurance. There would be no escape except death, and death would not come easily to someone who had learned too well how to survive. But there would be purpose. Not the false purpose of glory and honor that had motivated me as a neophyte, but something quieter and more durable. The purpose of bearing witness, of remembering when others forgot, of preserving humanity in a chapter that had been designed to strip humanity away, of choosing to care even when caring brought only pain, because the alternative was to become what Tiberius had become, and I was not yet ready to surrender the parts of myself that still struggled against that fate. The prayer ended, and I rose with my brothers, the moment of choice sealed into memory where it would remain for however many years or centuries I had left to serve. The crusade continued, and I continued with it, but something had fundamentally changed. I fought with the same skill, killed with the same efficiency, performed the same duties that decades of war had refined into automatic reflex. But now I did so with awareness of what I was and what I was becoming, and that awareness made all the difference between hollow performance and conscious sacrifice. Centuries passed. I can tell you this with certainty, because the chapter's archives mark time with obsessive precision, recording every battle and every death and every honor earned in service to the Eternal Crusade. But I cannot tell you how those centuries felt, because time loses meaning when every day is the same day repeated endlessly, when every battle blurs into every other battle until the individual engagements become indistinguishable from the whole. I fought on worlds whose names I no longer remember, against enemies whose faces have merged into a single composite image of everything we have ever opposed. Orcs and heretics and traitors and xenos, all of them dying beneath our fury, all of them replaced by new enemies before their bodies had cooled. I was promoted to Marshal when Helbrecht fell during a campaign against a Tyrannid splinter fleet, his death glorious and absolute, and exactly what he would have chosen if choice had been available. I took command of Crusade Fleet Adamant, 8 strike cruisers and their attendant vessels, 3,000 Black Templars who looked to me for leadership and guidance. I should have felt pride at the honor. Instead, I felt only the weight of responsibility, the burden of guiding others through the curse that I had come to understand but could not prevent. Now I stand on the bridge of the eternal wrath, the same strike cruiser that witnessed my initiation 3 centuries ago, watching as we translate back into real space above a world designated as War Zone Secundus. The ship's auger arrays paint tactical information across screens that have displayed similar information thousands of times before, showing enemy positions and imperial dispositions, and the mathematical certainty that blood will be spilled before this campaign concludes. My armor bears the scars of 10,000 engagements, ceramite that has been repaired and repainted so many times that little of the original plating remains. The chain on my wrist has been replaced dozens of times as links wore through or broke under stress, but it has never been removed, not once in 300 years. I look around the bridge at my brothers, at the faces that tell the story of what we are and what we will always be. Young faces full of zeal, initiates who still believe in the glory they have been promised, their eyes bright with the certainty that has not yet been worn down by the reality of endless war. Old faces hollow with endurance, veterans who have fought for decades or centuries, their expressions showing the distance that comes when you have seen too much and felt too little for too long. And between them, brothers at every stage of the journey from naive faith to empty continuation, each one fighting their own private battle against the erosion that will eventually claim us all. We are all cursed together. Every Black Templar who has ever taken the crusade vow, every warrior who has chained his weapon to his wrist and sworn to fight until death claims him. But we also endure it together, and that shared suffering creates bonds that transcend the individual despair each of us carries. We are brothers not just in gene seed and armor, but in the understanding that we walk a path that has no end except the one we cannot choose for ourselves. The crusade will never end. I know this with the certainty of mathematics and the weight of experience. There will always be another enemy, another world that requires purification, another war that demands our presence. We will fight until we fall, and those who survive will continue fighting, and the cycle will repeat itself across centuries and millennia until the Imperium itself finally falls, or the Emperor rises from his throne, or the stars themselves burn out. None of these outcomes seem likely in any time frame that matters to individual warriors like us. This is the curse of the Black Templars, to be so devoted to war that we can never escape it, to be so zealous in our crusade that we forget what we are crusading for. We are the Emperor's wrath given eternal form, but wrath is not meant to last forever. It burns too hot, consumes too much, leaves nothing but ash and the memory of fire. Yet we persist because we must, because our vows demand it, because we have lost the capacity for anything else. We are weapons that think we are men, or men who have become weapons. The distinction no longer matters. I look at the tactical display showing the war zone we are about to enter, at the markers indicating where enemies wait and where battles will be fought. Somewhere in that constellation of threats lies my death. Perhaps on this world, perhaps on the next, or the one after that. Perhaps decades from now or centuries, if I prove as durable as some of the ancient warriors whose names fill the memorial halls. But it waits for me somewhere, that final release that will break the chain and end the crusade, and grant me the peace that has been denied for so long. The knowledge brings something that might be relief, not joy, because joy is an emotion I can barely remember experiencing, but relief at the certainty that this will end, that the curse has limits even if those limits extend far beyond what any mortal should be asked to endure. One day, the chain will be broken. One day, my crusade will end. Until then, I will march with my brothers into the darkness, bearing the curse that makes us both the Imperium's greatest warriors and its most tragic prisoners. I give the order to prepare for deployment, and my brothers respond with the efficiency that centuries of war have bred into them. The familiar rituals begin. Weapons are blessed. Armor is checked. Prayers are offered to a god who may or may not hear them. And through it all, I feel the weight of the chain against my wrist, cold and familiar. A reminder that some bonds can never be broken. Not by time, not by distance, not even by death itself. We will crusade until the end of all things, and the end seems very far away.